Hello and welcome to the Past Connect channel. We're here to uncover the mysteries of the past and explore its fascinating stories. If you're ready, let's get started. The real Rosie the Riveter and other lesser-known iconic World War II facts and figures. One of World War II's most famous images, that is seen as iconic today, was hardly noticed by anybody during the conflict. One of the war's greatest technological breakthroughs, the world's first ballistic missile, was intended to wreak havoc and destruction. It did less than its creators sought, and after the war, more good than they had imagined. Below are 21 things about those and other lesser-known aspects of significant World War II facts and figures. 21. The We Can Do It poster. The We Can Do It is one of the most iconic images associated with World War II today. During the war itself, however, hardly anybody saw that poster or even knew it existed. The image was not created by the US government as inspirational propaganda for the public at large. Instead, it was commissioned by Westinghouse Electric and Manufacturing Company and targeted at its workers. Produced by graphic artist J. Howard Miller in 1943, it was part of a series of posters that were displayed for 2 weeks in some Westinghouse factories, before it was taken down. Nowadays, the poster is seen as a symbol of female empowerment, to the effect that women are strong and can do whatever they put their minds to. When Westinghouse commissioned it, though, the poster was intended to get female factory workers to work harder and follow orders. The "it" in the poster is clarified by a companion poster, in which a male manager counsels, "Any questions about your work? Ask your supervisor." In context, the poster was a paternalistic exhortation to female employees that all was possible, so long as they were team players and followed orders. Also, the woman depicted and often referred to as Rosie the Riveter was not a riveter. The posters were displayed in factories that produced helmet liners, a process that involves no riveting. It was largely forgotten until 1982 when the Washington Post magazine ran an article about posters in the National Archives that included We Can Do It. Nearly 4 decades after World War II, the poster finally gained notice and went viral. It was depicted on the cover of Smithsonian magazine, was featured in a US Post stamp, and was misinterpreted, or reinterpreted, by feminists as a call for female empowerment. 20. The real-life Rosie the Riveter. As seen above, the We Can Do It poster had nothing to do with Rosie the Riveter. However, there was a real-life woman, Rosalind P. Walter, née Palmer, 1924-2020, who inspired the Rosie the Riveter meme. Shortly after the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor thrust America into World War II, a teenaged Rosalind joined the war effort as an airplane factory riveter. Rosalind broke speed records on the production line, and advocated for equal pay for female factory workers. The New York Times ran an article about her that inspired a 1942 hit song, Rosie the Riveter, in honor of the working women who fueled America's war effort. The Rosie the Riveter meme took off, and became a stand-in for the millions of women who headed to the factories that supplied and supported the men in the field. In 1943, a Saturday Evening Post cover displayed a Norman Rockwell painting of a Rosie the Riveter, with a Mein Kampf beneath her feet. As to the original Rosie the Riveter, Rosalind P. Walter, already born into money, married into even more money, and became a renowned socialite and philanthropist. Among other things, she donated millions to help fund PBS, and became a trustee of both Long Island University and the American Museum of Natural History. 19. The flawed Stuka. The Stuka dive bomber, with its inverted gull wings and nerve-wracking shriek as it dove on targets, became the Blitzkrieg symbol and terrified soldiers and civilians alike. The Battle of Britain exposed its vulnerability when operating beyond an umbrella of German aerial superiority. In the right conditions, though, Stukas continued to wreak havoc until war's end. The Stuka was designed in secrecy in 1933, back when Germany still pretended to comply with the Treaty of Versailles and its prohibition of a German air force. A prototype was built in Sweden, smuggled into Germany in 1934, and test-flown in 1935. The inverted wings improved the pilot's ground visibility, and allowed a shorter and sturdier undercarriage while retaining sufficient ground clearance for the propeller. Ju-87A Stukas were tested during the Spanish Civil War. The Ju-87B version with which Germany entered World War II was typically armed with a 500-kilogram bomb. It had wind-driven sirens known as Jericho trumpets, that emitted an intimidating and demoralizing wail when the plane dove. The effect was enhanced by cardboard sirens on the bombs. Bomb load was increased to 1,800 kilograms in the upgraded Ju-87D, which entered service in 1941. The Ju-87G, which became operational in 1943, carried 2 armor-piercing 37mm cannons in lieu of bombs. It proved especially lethal against tanks, whose thinner top armor was vulnerable to attacks from above. The Stuka's greatest asset was its pinpoint accuracy by World War II standards. In the hands of an experienced pilot, it could destroy a zigzagging target. Germany's most decorated serviceman of the war, Hans-Ulrich Rudel, is credited with destroying 519 tanks, over 800 vehicles, 150 artillery positions, damaging a battleship, sinking a cruiser, a destroyer, 70 other seacraft, and downing 9 airplanes, mostly while flying a Stuka. 18. Churchill's war end brain fart. In the spring of 1945, as the war in Europe drew to a close, Winston Churchill was exasperated by Soviet intransigence regarding Eastern Europe, which Stalin clearly aimed to turn into a Soviet empire. Britain had gone to war in order to defend Polish independence. At war's end, however, Stalin rode roughshod over the Poles. He kept the third of their country he had annexed in 1939 in cooperation with the Germans, reduced them to a Soviet client state, and extinguished their freedom and independence. Churchill saw the protection of Polish rights as a matter that touched upon British honor. So he ordered his generals to draw up plans for an attack on the Soviets soon as Germany surrendered. The goal was to push them back to the USSR's borders, or at least force them to treat Poland fairly. Churchill's generals presented him with Operation Unthinkable, whose title indicates what they thought of the Prime Minister's idea. 2 versions were offered, an offensive and defensive one. The offensive envisaged a surprise attack on the Soviets in July, 1945, intended to force Stalin to give Poland a fair deal. The defensive envisaged a British defense of Western Europe after America withdrew from the continent. The Soviets had 10 million men available in the summer of 1945. They outnumbered the British and Americans in Europe 4:1 in men, and 2:1 in tanks, and superior tanks at that. The Allies had an advantage in the air, but even that was subject to challenge as the Red Air Force by 1945 had formidable fighter and ground attack arms. 17. The unthinkable Operation Unthinkable. The Soviet military by 1945 was not the hapless rabble it had been in 1941 when the Germans invaded. It had grown into a veteran and battle-hardened force that had won bigger campaigns against significantly greater opposition than the Allies had faced. In a nutshell, Churchill's generals concluded that it would be ill-advised to pick a fight with the Soviets. Far from being a pushover, the Red Army in 1945 was dangerous, vicious, and very big. If war broke out, it was more likely to end with the Red Army's conquest of all of continental Europe, rather than with the Red Army getting chased back to the Soviet Union's borders. More importantly, Churchill's generals pointed out, Britain on her own stood no chance against the Soviets. The US had no incentive to attack them, especially not over Poland and Eastern Europe. To stand up for Poland was a point of honor for Churchill. However, few in the British government, and fewer still in that of the US, thought Poland or Eastern Europe were worth an even greater war against the Soviet Union than the one they had just concluded against Germany. Unlike Britain, America had never guaranteed Poland's territorial integrity, nor had it entered World War II in order to defend Polish sovereignty. Presented with such unwelcome facts, Churchill grudgingly let the matter drop, and Operation Unthinkable was archived. 16. The French debacle in 1940. The French had been traumatized by World War I and by the devastation suffered by the parts of their country that had been fought over. So they devised a plan to avoid a repetition in case of a future war against Germany. The Maginot Line would secure the Franco-German border to the south, while the bulk of the mobile French army was stationed in the north. It would advance into Belgium soon as the Germans attacked, to fight as far forward and outside of France as possible. The French had adequately fortified the south, and amassed enough mobile forces in the north to keep the Germans from bursting into France via that route. However, they ignored a stretch of wooded terrain in the center, the Ardennes forest. They figured it was impassable for tanks and so they kept it lightly defended. The Germans figured the Ardennes was actually passable for tanks, so they massed the bulk of their armor against that sector. When the Blitzkrieg burst through the Ardennes and raced to the English Channel to sever France's armies in the north from the rest of the country, the French were caught wrong-footed. Their mobile forces were advancing into Belgium, and couldn't be turned around in time to stop the Germans pouring out of the Ardennes. The French also lacked adequate reserves to send in and plug the widening gap. Collapse quickly followed, and the same country that 2 decades earlier had fought the Germans for 4 bloody years and emerged victorious in World War I, capitulated and signed a humiliating surrender after just 40 days fighting in World War II. 15. The turning of the tide in the Pacific. The surprise Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor in 1941 had been overseen by Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto, commander of the combined Japanese Imperial Fleet. Yamamoto, a prophet of the naval air power that devastated Pearl Harbor, was the Japanese Navy's dominant figure. A determined and aggressive commander, he drew bold and imaginative plans. He also possessed the kind of strong leadership that ensured such plans were embraced by his subordinates, who idolized Yamamoto and strove to execute his orders with vigor and skill. A chess champion of the Japanese Navy, he also became an excellent poker player while studying and serving as an attaché in America. U.S. intelligence judged him exceptionally able, forceful, and quick-thinking. After Pearl Harbor, the Japanese under Yamamoto went on a rampage and won stunning victories. The Japanese wanted a battle of annihilation, like the 1905 Battle of Tsushima that had decided the Russo-Japanese War, then negotiate a favorable peace. Pearl Harbor was a success, but no Tsushima, so the Japanese figured an invasion of Midway Island might lure what's left of the U.S. Navy to show up for a climactic showdown. However, U.S. cryptanalysts had cracked Japanese codes and knew of the upcoming attack. Moreover, the Americans had more carriers in the Pacific than expected. One had been transferred from the Atlantic, and another that had been damaged in an earlier battle and was expected to take months to fix, was rushed back into service after 48 hours of repairs. The Japanese had expected to deal with only 1 or 2 American fleet carriers. Instead, they would face 3 carriers and an alert enemy waiting in ambush rather than one caught off guard. 14. A dramatic victory. The Japanese launched a carrier strike against Midway on the morning of June 4, 1942. They inflicted significant damage, but a second strike was necessary. While their aircraft were recovered and readied, the Japanese learned of the presence of American carriers. Midway wasn't going anywhere, and the destruction of enemy aircraft carriers was more important. So orders were given to switch bombs from ones intended for ground targets, to anti-ship bombs and torpedoes. In the meantime, the American carriers had launched their own aircraft against the Japanese. First to arrive were Devastator torpedo bombers, slow planes that had to fly low, steady, and straight to launch their torpedoes. 41 Devastators attacked without fighter escort. 35 were shot down and not a single hit was scored. While the American torpedo bombers were getting slaughtered, a flight of American Dauntless dive bombers was lost, trying to locate the Japanese. They had neared the point beyond which they wouldn't have enough fuel to return to their carriers, but their commander persisted. He was rewarded by spotting a lone Japanese destroyer below. Guessing that it was heading to rejoin its fleet, he used its wake as an arrow. It led him straight to the Japanese fleet. And a Japanese fleet caught at the worst possible time for an attack from dive bombers. The carriers were rearming and refueling, so their decks were full of bombs and torpedoes and fuel. There was also no fighter cover. The Japanese fighters had gone down to intercept and destroy the torpedo bombers that had attacked at low level. They hadn't yet regained altitude when the American dive bombers showed up high above and dove down. Within 5 minutes, 3 of the 4 Japanese aircraft carriers were burning. The 4th was sunk later that day. 13. Breaking the spell of German invincibility at Stalingrad. The 1942 German summer offensive sought to capture the Soviets' oil fields in the Caucasus. Stalingrad was intended as the easternmost anchor of a line between the rivers Don and Volga, to protect the advance into the Caucasus from attack in the rear. However, the symbolism of a city named after Stalin grabbed the attention of the egomaniacal German and Soviet warlords, and what began as relatively unimportant morphed into a major showdown. Hitler poured more and more resources to capture the city. The Soviets' fierce resistance and the Germans' fierce attacks were initially based on the symbolism of the city's name. However, the Soviets soon saw greater potential and began to think big. The Germans remained focused on the fight for the city, with its capture as an ultimate end. The Soviets saw the defense of the city as simply a means to a more ambitious end. German prisoners captured at Stalingrad. Life magazine. Advertisement. Continue reading below. The Red Army fed enough forces and supplies into Stalingrad to keep the battle going and the Germans engaged. In the meantime, they massed huge armies hundreds of miles to either side. They were intended for a pincer attack, Operation Uranus, to bag the Germans inside the city and the Axis armies guarding their flanks. Operation Uranus went like clockwork. The Soviets smashed through the Italian, Romanian, and Hungarian armies protecting the Germans in Stalingrad, and within 4 days the Soviet pincers met. The disaster was made worse by Hitler's insistence that the Germans inside Stalingrad stay put and fight it out until relieved by a rescue force, rather than try and break out. No rescue came. By the time the last Germans in Stalingrad surrendered in February 1943, the Axis had suffered 728,000 casualties, and the German military's spell of invincibility was broken.